XVI I Like Ike, Part 2. I was talking about the election. I forgot to mention one rather trivial thing, but it's on the outline, so let me make sure to mention it. Let me jump to the next slide. So, back to the thing. This says Korean War issue. Okay, so remember, in the election of 52, the Korean War was still underway, or police action, if you prefer, although by that point it was pretty much just kind of a stalemate. Okay. In fact, thinking back to the Cold War lecture, I mentioned the Korean War. I talked a lot about it, but one thing I forgot to mention on that outline it says limited war. And I didn't really talk about that. Let me slip in a couple sentences about that real quick because it ties in with the 52 election. I had told you that Truman had fired MacArthur. MacArthur wanted to expand the war against the Chinese, and Truman was trying to keep it from growing into World War III. And Truman ends up firing MacArthur, and we reach this stalemate. Okay, it's a limited war. It's like we're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. And a lot of people aren't happy about that. Okay, I mean, we defeated Hitler, we defeated the Japanese. Why are we now fighting the North Koreans and Chinese to a tie? And then all that seesaw movement we talked about, or I talked about, up and down the Korean Peninsula, it was all in 1950, and then 51 and 52, the war's kind of stagnant, and so there's a lot of people upset that the war's just dragging on and on and on. And that's one of the things that Eisenhower, when he's running, could highlight, that maybe because of his military experience, he might have the skill set to maybe try to wrap this thing up. Okay, so where it says Korean War issue, that's what they're talking about. And so I thought I would slip that in here because I had accidentally forgot to mention it. But I'd already showed you the election map and that Eisenhower had won big time. So let's press forward into the Eisenhower term. Now Eisenhower will serve 2 terms at 8. That's 8 years, so from 52 and up until the 1960 election. So he's always associated with the 50s. I mean, Truman's there for the first 2 years, but when people think of the 50s, one of the things they think about is Dwight David Eisenhower. Just they kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly. Okay, all right, or macaroni and cheese. All right. So let's get on with it, shall we? All right, so let's go to the next slide here. Eisenhower, as I said, wins big time. There he is, 34th president. Looks like everybody's grandfather. Now, Dwight David Eisenhower as president. Some of this I'll skip over because it wouldn't make good multiple choice questions for the final. But I've told you he's a little bit more of a liberal Republican, not looking to dismantle the New Deal necessarily, but maybe a little more. Well, we'll get to that. They talk about dynamic conservatism. Well, it seems like a kind of a contradiction. Dynamic is action-oriented and things are happening. Conservative is usually a little more status quo. So he's kind of contradict. So remember, we've had 16 years for, and then we've had 20 years. 20 years of Democrats from 32 to 52, okay? And the New Deal, and then Truman and his Fair Deal, and so all kinds of government activity. And so, like I said, they're trying to be a little less big government oriented. It's hard to pin down. The textbook will probably do a better job of explaining it. This is kind of an odd phrase, dynamic conservatism. But let's not go in and repeal all the new. Let's not try to get rid of Social Security. It's already there. We'll just let it go. But definitely less government involvement in business. Okay, Republicans tend to be a little more favorable to big business because those employ people. Example of this. Less government involves the Tidewater oil lands. Honestly, I don't want to talk about that. I'm going to skip over it. It has to do with offshore oil drilling rights off the coast of Texas, and should those belong to the state or the national government, but it won't be on the test. I'm not going to worry about it. Eisenhower, by the way, likes to play golf. Okay, I hear he's playing golf with Vice President Nixon. If you're the Vice President, you go ahead and let the President win. I know you don't want to be seen like a suck up, do you? I don't know. Let's get forward with some actual testable type material. Yeah, I really like to play golf. All right, now we're getting into some new stuff here. Preservation of the New Deal, already talked about that. Okay. Civil rights advances. One of the things the 50s is remembered for is the really waking up of the civil rights movement. You know, it had never gone away. Remember, the NAACP had been formed back in 1909. So people have been working on this. During World War II, there was the Double V campaign. Okay, and then Truman had his committee on looking into civil rights. So it's not just like someone flipped a switch and in 1954, oh look, there's a civil rights movement, and that's when it really starts to take off. Okay? There were some court cases prior to 54 that we won't go into, Sweat versus Painter, things like that. But there's only so many hours in the day. Okay, so let me focus on the big one. Uh, the guy on the right, Earl Warren, is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Okay, so it's usually known as the Warren Court. It's around for a while and makes a lot of major rulings. The really big ruling, the important one that we're going to talk about on this lecture outline is Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Okay, and this goes to Earl Warren's Supreme Court. Okay, I'll explain what this is here in just a second. Okay, so to be specific, it's Brown and some other plaintiffs, but Brown is first alphabetically, so it's always abbreviated Brown versus Board of Education. But it's actually Brown, comma, and a bunch of other people as well. Okay? And the Board of Education is of Topeka, Kansas. Okay? Let me double check that real quick because I said it wrong once. Yes, Topeka, Kansas. I knew that, but though, like I think it was last year, I accidentally said the wrong state somehow. Okay, so Topeka, Kansas. Now, this is a case brought by the NAACP, and what it's trying to do is challenge the doctrine of separate but equal, which had been established under Plessy versus Ferguson back in 1896. Okay, so if you recall that from the very beginning of the semester, excuse me, the Supreme Court had ruled that it was okay to segregate, but the facilities had to be equal. You can't discriminate against black Americans. They pay taxes like everybody else. They're supposed to get equal facilities. What we found, however, was it was easy to say that it sounds good, but in practice it never seemed to really work that way. If a school district gets new textbooks in, guess where the textbooks go? Yeah, they go to the white school. The old textbooks go to the black school, which is probably one of the oldest buildings in the district. Okay, and the NAACP brought this case to challenge this concept. Okay, now apparently one reason they picked Topeka, from what I understand, I heard a pretty good lecture on this once, is that Topeka actually had some of the better black schools. That they had actually tried to do a good job with the black schools. Okay, and that the NAACP specifically went after that because they wanted to prove that even the best intended, best attempts at segregated schools weren't equal. If they'd gone after Mississippi, or Alabama, or one of those deep South old Confederacy states, and they had won a victory, it would be like, well, sure, the black schools in Mississippi are bad. All the schools in Mississippi are bad. Okay, so they went after Topeka to show that even a well-intentioned school board that was trying to do it right, it was still problematic. Okay? And so the parameters of the case, basically, Mr. Brown had a daughter. If I recall, her name was Linda. And he would like her to go to the neighborhood school in the neighborhood they live in, but she has to go to the black school. So they went to the court and they argued that so they had to cross a heavy busy highway, and go for some railroad tracks and walk so many blocks. It was a dangerous commute to walk to school. Okay, and it was farther than just going to a neighborhood school. And so that's part of what they argued. Okay? That this is unreasonable, it's not equal, that she's having to go that far. Okay? Now, one of the lawyers arguing this before the Supreme Court is a guy named Thurgood Marshall. Okay? Thurgood Marshall. He is a black lawyer who works for the NAACP. He's one of the lawyers arguing this before the Supreme Court. If you still had the end of course test going, he would be a really important name to know because he eventually will be the first black on the Supreme Court, which makes him historically significant. And the end of course test loves that sort of thing. You know, first man, first woman, first black, first Jew, first white, first man on the moon. First man to fly the Atlantic. The end course test loves that kind of stuff, but you don't have to worry about it now. But you should know who this guy is, Thurgood Marshall. Don't confuse him with Secretary of State George Marshall. That's a rookie mistake. Okay, all right. And what Marshall's going to argue in the course of this case, basically, is that just the very fact that you're segregating the black children and putting them aside puts like a social stigma on them that, you know what, we're not good enough to go to school with the white kids. Okay? That even if the facilities were equal, you know, that it's inherently wrong that that they won't get an equal education. They'll be seen, as or the people who are sent to bad school or the old school, okay, the separate school. And so in a landmark decision in 1954, the Supreme Court rules in favor of the NAACP and Mr. Brown. Okay? This effectively, more or less, kind of overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, I think I read once that technically they never actually said Plessy versus Ferguson has been overturned, but for all practical purposes, it does. Okay, separate but equal can't be equal, and the schools should be desegregated with all due speed. Okay. So the next day, everybody gets up and the schools are desegregated, right? No, it's going to take some time. Okay, you can't just turn it on and off like a switch overnight. But here's where the civil rights movement really starts to kick into high gear. And if we were doing the essay question, which at this point I think is like 99% certain we probably won't, because I just can't imagine how we're going to fit that in under the circumstances this semester. But the essay question prompt asks about, how does the civil rights movement progress from 1954 to 1965? Okay, so anyway, this kind of really puts it into high gear. It's always been there, but it really kind of slaps into a much faster pace after Brown versus Board of Education. It's one of the handful of Supreme Court cases that everybody always talks about. Okay? So that's domestic. We have to jump over to foreign affairs. We're coming up near the time limit on the allowable length of these things. So rather than start the next slide and then have to stop almost immediately, we'll stop here. We'll switch over to foreign events with the next video.